growth of the towns, the Italian city republics. The Teutons and the Roman towns. The barbarians who overran the Roman Empire had no love for city life, hence the Roman cities fared hard at their hands. In England, the Angles and Saxons seemed to have almost destroyed them. The present English towns have grown up, the greater number of them since the invasion, having been built anew from their foundations, often, however, on the old sites. A somewhat similar fate apparently befell the cities of northern France. In southern France, however, and in Italy and Spain, they escaped destruction, yet the result of the conquest everywhere was the decline of the towns in population and importance. The city gave place to the castle. Revival of the old towns and founding of new ones, but as soon as the invaders had become settled and civilization had begun to revive, the old Roman towns began gradually to assume somewhat of their former importance, and new ones to spring up in those provinces where they had been swept away and in the countries outside of the limits of the ancient empire. The location of the new towns was determined by different circumstances. The necessities of trade and commerce pointed out the sites of many of them and formed the basis of their growth and prosperity. Favorable locations on the seacoasts, upon the great rivers, or along the overland routes of travel were naturally chosen as depots for exchanging, distributing, and forwarding the wares and products of the times. On such spots grew up opulent and powerful capitals. When feudalism took possession of Europe, we have the relation of the cities to the feudal lords. The cities, which became part of the system as well, each town formed a part of the fief in which it happened to be situated and was subject to all the incidents of feudal ownership. It owned allegiance to its lord, must pay to him feudal tribute, and aid him in his war enterprises. As the cities, through their manufactures and trade, were the most wealthy members of the feudal system, the lords naturally took them for granted and looked to them for money when in need. Their demands and exactions at last became unendurable, and a long struggle broke out between them and the burghers, which resulted in what is known as the enfranchisement of the towns. It was in the 11th century that this revolt of the cities against the feudal lords became general. During the course of this and the succeeding century, the greater number of towns of the countries of Western Europe either bought or wrested by force of arms charters from their lords or suzerains. The cities thus character did not become independent of the feudal lords, but they acquired the right of managing with more or less supervision their own affairs and were secured against arbitrary and oppressive taxation. This was a great gain, and as under the protection of their charters they grew in wealth and population, very many of them became at last strong enough to cast off a actual dependence upon lord or suzerain and become in effect independent states or tiny commonwealths. Especially was this true in the case of the Italian cities, and in a less marked degree in that of the German towns. Respecting the fortunes of the cities in these two countries, we will now speak with some detail concerning the rise of the Italian city republics. The Italian cities were the first to rise to power and importance. Several things conspired to secure this early and rapid development. First, the cities of Italy had become, under the imperial government, more perfectly developed as municipalities than the towns of other parts of the empire. Then they suffered less from the barbarian invaders and were thus able to retain a very perfect degree their municipal organization. Again, the feudal system was less perfectly developed in the peninsula than elsewhere, the lords being obliged from the very first to divide power within the cities, which never became so completely subjected to the nobility as did those of other countries. Finally, the small number of the barbarians in Italy forced the chiefs and nobles to build their castles for the sake of greater security within the walls of some city instead of in the open country, which circumstance added greatly to the strength and importance of towns. But the main cause of the prosperity and influence of the Italian cities was their trade with the East. and the enormous impulse given to that commerce by the Crusades. Venice, Genoa, and Pisa became immensely rich through the vast transport business thrown into the hands of their merchants by the crusading movement. And after the Crusades had ceased, the trade to which they had been given birth still continued, the returning Crusaders bringing back with them a taste for Oriental customs and notions created a great demand for articles of refinement and luxury, which could be supplied only by the Italian traders through their eastern connections. With wealth came power, and all the chief Italian cities became distinct, self-governing states with just a nominal dependence upon the Pope or Emperor. Towards the close of the 13th century, northern and central Italy was divided among about 200 little city republics. Italy had become another Greece. The political history of these states is very obscure, intricate, and uninteresting, but their social, artistic, and commercial records form the most brilliant pages of the annals of the Middle Ages. There are, however, three important matters which may be considered as belonging to their general political history: the formation of the Lombard League, the dissensions of the 12th and 13th centuries, and the conversion of the republics into hereditary principalities. And as we shall speak of each of these matters under a separate head, we shall also proceed to notice some of the more interesting and instructive circumstances in the separate commercial, social, or artistic life of the representative states of Venice, Pisa, Genoa, and Florence. Concerning the Lombard League, it was a union of the principal cities of northern Italy, headed by Milan for the purpose of resisting the pretensions of the German imperator, who claimed tribute as their suzerain. The kings of Germany, it must be borne in mind, had always considered Italy as a fief of their empire ever since Charlemagne's conquest of the country and his coronation by the Pope as King of the Romans in the year 800. This suzerainty was really scarcely more than nominal. It imposed upon the Italians little more than the payment of a small tribute and the use of the imperator's name in state documents. In some of the German imperators never even visited Italy at all, and the manner in which the emperor was received by the Italians when he did make a journey into this quarter of his dominions illustrates how very little like sovereign authority was his rule over them. Thus, so jealous were the Italians of the freedom of their cities, the imperial train was not allowed to establish itself within the city walls. The royal castle found at each chief city was always outside the city defenses, and there his Majesty's court was accommodated during his visit. The Emperor Frederick Barbarossa endeavored to extend and strengthen the imperial authority over these Italian cities. His aim was to reduce them from vassals or allies to subjects, to make himself their emperor in fact as well as in name. Milan resisted. Barbarossa crossed the Alps with a large army, captured the rebellious city, scattered its inhabitants, and leveled its walls and houses to the ground. A confederation known as the Lombard League was now formed by the exiled Milanese and a large number of the cities of northern Italy for the purpose of avenging the wrongs of Milan and resisting the emperor's schemes of ambition. A great battle was fought between the forces of the League and those of the emperor at Legnano in the year 1176. The Germans suffered an overwhelming defeat. This battle was memorable because it was the first instance in the history of the Middle Ages in which municipalities joined together in successful resistance to one of the great sovereigns of Europe. In the Treaty of Constance, which was arranged in the year 1183, the right of the cities to self-government was granted, although they were to swear to the emperor as overlord and pay a nominal tribute as a token of their vassalage. The Lombard League was almost the only instance of a confederation being effected among the city-states of Italy. Their entire history is an all but unbroken record of quarrels, dissensions, and wars among themselves. The dispute between them and the head of the Holy Roman Empire divided the population of the different cities into two great parties: those who adhered to the emperor and those who espoused the cause of his enemy, the Pope. The quarrels between these rival parties kept all Italy in a perfect turmoil for several centuries. Commercial rivalry and jealousy was another source of endless disputes and wars among the Italian cities, and still a third cause of trouble and dissension within the walls of each city was the presence there of the feudal lords. These streets were kept wet with the blood of the quarrelsome retainers of rival houses. Shakespeare's tragedy of Romeo and Juliet is based upon the feud of two such rival houses of Verona, uh, of the Capulets and the Montagues. We see them while tracing the story of the Italian republics to be following again the history of the cities of Greece. The great political defect in the Grecian character was an utter inability to broaden love of city into love of country, to raise municipal sentiment into patriotism. We meet the same fault in the Italian character. For illustration, the Venetians had this maxim: Venice first, Christians next, and Italy afterwards. The results to Italy of this narrow, jealous spirit were several centuries of dissensions and wars, and of shameful subjection to foreign powers, to the sovereigns of Spain, France, and Germany. French and German and Spanish soldiers were constantly plundering her cities and trampling down the harvests. United, Italy might easily have kept its coast against every enemy by way of the sea, and have so manned the passes of the Alps, those barriers which to Cicero seemed raised by the gods especially for the protection of the peninsula, that the combined armies of the north might have vainly attempted to storm those defenses. Just what happened among the contending republics of Greece took place in the case of the quarreling city-commonwealths of Italy. Their republican constitutions were overthrown, and the supreme power fell into the hands of an ambitious aristocracy, overseized by some bold usurper who often succeeded in making the government hereditary in his family. Before the close of the 14th century, almost all the republics of the peninsula had become converted into exclusive oligarchies or hereditary principalities. One thing which favored the schemes of ambitious leaders was the custom of the cities, a custom which became common among them as the military spirit declined among their trade-loving citizens, of employing mercenary soldiers to fight their battles. These hirelings were called condottieri, and were at the service of the highest bidder. Their captains were usually soldiers of fortune. Very soon the employers of these conscienceless mercenaries found themselves completely in their power. The leaders of the bands often betrayed the liberties of the states that they had been hired to defend, and upon the ruins of their republican institutions set up military despotisms. Again, in other cities, the heads of powerful families acquired in a more legitimate way, by the ascendancy of wealth or through extended business, local and political connections, the control of the government, and while preserving, as did Augustus and his immediate successors at Rome, all the forms of the republican state, ruled with an absolute an authority as did those same imperial usurpers. Thus it was that the famous family of the Medici obtained control of affairs at Florence, and we shall now relate some circumstances, for the most part of a commercial or social character, which concerned some of the most renowned of the Italian city-states. And first we'll talk about Venice, the most famous of the Italian republics. And then we'll go to Genoa, and then Pisa, and Florence. And then of course the influence of the medieval cities, and I probably will skip Genoa because that's the only one I haven't been to. Venice, the most famous of the Italian republics, had its beginnings in the 5th century in the rude huts of some refugees who fled out into the marshes of the Adriatic to escape the fury of the Huns of Attila. So I'm going to go do, Venice is going to be a separate reading. And then I'll come back and do the rest. I'll come back and do, I'll do Venice, Pisa, and Florence.